My name is Rashaad Ali. I'm from the glorious and wonderful city of Sheffield, actually, the great industrial centre of the world, to be completely honest. I've been involved in looking at matters related to Islam, Muslims, the problems of radicalisation, integration, and so on for, I guess, in one way or the other, for the last 18 years. In the last 5 years I've been working quite actively involved in basically countering radicalisation and addressing issues related to integration matters within communities that belong to the various diverse Muslim communities in the UK. It was a very multicultural society, and I mean that in the genuine sense of what multicultural societies are. We literally grew up in what people describe, I guess, today as one of those communities where everybody lived in everyone's houses, where they describe how you all the kids grew up together. It wasn't one that the tensions were between the wider community and different races. In fact, arguably the tensions were probably intra-racial between Indian subcontinent communities, between Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, more so than between Asians and white people. I had a fairly enjoyable school upbringing as well. I remember, I remember attending what was a fairly mixed school in terms of its racial makeup as well. I then went into a secondary school or a comprehensive school, a state school, which incidentally was the one that Lord Sebastian Coe attended for his sixth form education, who was known as Seb Coe back then. And again, had a very, very diverse mixture in terms of ethnic backgrounds and population, and so it was one which attempted to integrate those different value systems. And I use that in a non-kind of common social policy type of way. I mean, it literally tried to piece together the different type of ethnic backgrounds and communities. So, as an example, we had the regular assembly, which was once a week. We had a religious assembly once a week, and the religious assemblies were divided. So we had a non-religious ethical assembly, which was obviously as described. It was to discuss moral issues, but without a religious frame. We had a Christian assembly, which incidentally had the smallest kind of uptake, and we had a Muslim assembly. And the pupils were allowed to choose whichever one they wished to go to. So it wasn't that it was dictated to, it was actually at your leisure and at your choice, although generally speaking most Muslims went to the Muslim assembly, etc. It was in that time when I was probably around 12, 13, 14 and was approaching issues of identity, and you start to recognise a number of things. You recognise, as you do, that you are ever so slightly different from wider communities. Not in a pejorative sense or a negative sense, but you start to recognise certain aspects of your culture that are different. You have these odd rules related to what you can and can't eat. The canteen served certain types of food which was halal and appropriate for Muslims, and food which wasn't halal and not appropriate for Muslims. You take odd days off from school because of your Eid celebration. And these things that differentiate you, and also other communities which really didn't understand your religious culture. I grew up at the time when the Salman Rushdie affair was a huge thing that happened in our society, in our community in Britain. Salman Rushdie, who was a popular author, and the famous book, or the infamous and famous book, the Satanic Verses, was released again in the late 80s, and it was something that we all discussed, we all debated. And I remember having this conversation with a good friend of mine, who I kind of still have semi-contact with, but I'd grown up with him since I was 4 or 5 years old, and explaining and regurgitating things that I'd heard about it, which was, hold on a second, this is a book that insults British people, it's a book that insults the Queen, it's a book that insults our way of life, etc., etc. And him turning around and saying, yeah, it's perfectly fine, why not? It's free speech. He wants to insult the Queen, he insults the Queen. And at the time I found that as a strong retort, but I didn't quite comprehend, I did understand what he was saying, but it didn't necessarily hit home to make me challenge my own kind of identity or understanding of this. It was just something, we've been insulted and this is a response in our communities that, surely we shouldn't be supporting such a publication. On the other hand, my eldest brother did buy a copy of the Static Verses, so I did actually have a copy to look at and to read. So it was something that kind of affected people, and at the time, I guess, there wasn't a lot of it that really I fully understood or grasped or fully understood what the issues were around it until maybe several years later. In terms of the influences, I guess when I was approaching 12, 13, 14, I started to come across members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. Hizb ut-Tahrir is this, I guess the best description is a radical, revolutionary type of Islamist movement. It's a movement that essentially is exactly the same as probably the most extreme form of a Trotskyite communist party, but filled its particular ideas about how it should rule, govern, what type of laws it should have, by a pseudo-religious framework. It sought to interpret what Muslims call the Sharia, or sacred law or religious right, and it sought to interpret the scriptures of the Muslims as being a static law that should be enforced over society. There were issues that were happening around us at the time. There was, throughout the 90s, there was a greater sense of difference for Muslims. And this was developing in various different ways. I mean, you had the conflict in Bosnia, which made it very, very clear that the Bosnians, which, to be honest, is very difficult for people to get their head around, Bosnians who are not ethnically, they're not phenotypically any different to Serbs. There's no phenotypical distinction as there is very easily between Pakistanis and ethnically or indigenous English, white, Caucasian people. So they were exactly the same as Serbs, but in fact, culturally they were very similar. They were not seen as people who were culturally distinct in their Islam. They were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, they drank alcohol, they lived amongst the people, but they had this identity. They were called Bosniaks. And that was purely because of their religious heritage. There was something that differentiated them, that allowed them to be persecuted by their very neighbours, by the very community they were from, and to be seen as alien. And this carried on for some time without any intervention in the West. It was a major issue. I mean, it was something that was very big. And this kind of tied onto the back of things like, what was happening with the first Gulf War in 1990, which kind of, which were very interesting as questions for us to think about. That, did we support the Iraqi people? Did we support Saddam Hussein? Obviously, we didn't. But then, obviously we saw that as a war for oil. I remember very distinctly having this discussion, even at a very young age, that seeing that as, at least being informed of a context that this was America leading a war with the West when Iraq invaded Kuwait, not because, this was there really to liberate the Kuwaiti people, but was there really for oil. And there was this quotation that was going around from Senator Bob Dole at the time, that he said, don't think it's worth a single American life to go and restore the Sabah family, but it's about oil and the American way of life and American jobs and so on. So there was this kind of bubbling in the background. But I think very key, one of the biggest things was when I was 13, 14, 15, I did come across members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And what they did do is they started to address issues in a way that shifted that focus and brought those things to the fore. So they created this mindset that, look, hold on a second, you are different. You are different from your peer group, you're different from the wider society, and in fact you're distinct. So, you're not someone that believes in inerrant science, and you actually do question things like evolution. You don't believe in atheism as a rational dogma. You see it as fundamentally irrational. Your belief in God is a powerful belief. It's one that you should be proud of, and not the other way around. You shouldn't feel inferior to the mainstream society because you're religious and they're not. You should feel proud of the fact that your dogma is a rational belief. And it was maybe something that was happening at the time that wouldn't happen today, I guess, or I hope it wouldn't happen today, is that there was no real awareness of who groups like this were. Whilst bearing in mind your differences and distinctions, you do start to question who you are, your identity, what role you play, what's your purpose, etc. So all those types of questions, I guess, you're vulnerable to a certain extent in your teen years. But what Hizb ut-Tahrir did is they brought these questions to the fore. So, and how they did this was actually when I was at school, they would come and address the Muslim assemblies. And at the time, there was no awareness as to who they were, what their ideology was, what the dangers were associated with them. And therefore, it was perfectly normal because these were other college lecturers. These were civil engineering graduates at the university. These were science and chemistry teachers from the college. These were PGCE students at the university who were training to be teachers. So it was perfectly normal that these people would come and address a Muslim assembly, and they're implicitly trusted. But actually what they were doing was building these ideas and picking out individuals, so people who did respond to those things. And so they would address issues of identity, that look, you're a Muslim, you're not a part-time Muslim, you're not a Muslim only on Friday or only in Ramadan or only on the day of Eid. You're a Muslim all the time, which means it affects your behaviour in the school, it affects your behaviour in the grounds of the school. You don't fight, you're not racist, your identity is Muslim. You don't look down on people for their colour. You have a belief that unifies you. You belong to the global Muslim community. All these types of notions of differentiating you and giving you a positive identity, a sense of belonging to the whole Muslim nation. So these were things that you kind of latched onto, the ideas, the intellectual essence, the identity, the sense of belonging. And they did two other things. They started to address the concerns that you're having. The political issues, whether they were what was happening in Bosnia, whether that was the motives for wars in the world, whether that was oppression and tyranny or injustice. I remember having a conversation with my form tutor, who was from an Irish background, and she'd just taken over, taking us for the year, and she'd literally just taken over, and so she asked us to write a little essay about ourselves. And I remember very, very clearly writing something along the lines of, I guess people would call me a fundamentalist because I believe in the fundamentals of my religion and faith and so on. And she raised this with me as not in a pejorative sense or a negative sense, but she raised it as an interesting conversation, and we started talking about what I felt, my sympathy for the IRA, because I felt, well, look, they're fighting a nationalist cause. This was a cause that I could understand. It was against colonialism. It was something that I could understand given my heritage, from the Indian subcontinent. This was something I could understand from the perspective of the oppression of the British yoke over the Irish people and everything that happened there. And so I could relate and sympathise and empathise with that cause. She was very understanding, and also made it very clear that she understood the issues far better than I did. And I was like, yeah, fair enough, but I was drawing an analogy to the Palestinian cause at the time. Then actually Palestine is a similar cause. It's people who have a territory which is occupied, and they don't have a right to self-determination, they don't have a state. This is recognised internationally, but nobody is doing anything about it. Unlike when Saddam went into Kuwait and he occupied it, every world rallied around and they did something about it, whereas the Palestinian cause has been going on for years and years and years and decades, and people are happy to let the Israelis continue doing this. And I drew this kind of broad analogy to that. So I guess to a large extent there was a recognition of some of these political grievances that required resolution. there was a recognition of the identity distinction, and there was a general connection to the Muslim Ummah, the Muslim people, or the Muslim fraternity as having a sense of belonging to it. And these were the kind of debates and discussions which initially attracted me to the group. In that sense, I didn't have this detachment. It was a created kind of detachment. It was one that made me feel different. So it was this kind of propaganda that made me come to this realization that actually, even though emotionally I had a sense of engagement and belonging, fundamentally at a more core level, I was different. And fundamentally, at a more core level, my belonging should belong to the global Muslim entity. You know, our public debates are fundamentally secular, whereas Muslims tend to have their religious identity and their religious praxis still informs much of their thinking about their lifestyle, and that's very different to a liberal, the kind of attitudes that arise from a liberal culture. So there's a recognition of these types of things. So I think there was probably, I always think of what is it that attracted me, and I think there were three things. The first is it answered these existential questions, but it answered these existential questions not in a normal religious way. Normal discussions with people about religion tend to be, what do we believe? You believe X. You believe in a God, you believe in a hereafter, you believe in angels, you believe in the books, etc. Hizb ut-Tahrir's approach was completely the opposite. It was, why do you believe in God? Why don't you believe in materialism? Why hasn't the universe always been here? The laws of thermodynamics, the matter, energy, they change into one another. Why doesn't that mean the universe is eternal? And so that actually questioned me to the extent that I needed answers to these questions, and then they provided answers which you could question and debate and argue at. They challenged, debated, discussed, and they convinced me. And this is the other thing: it gives you a confidence. So now you're not the person whose belief system you should be. Am I a minority? Am I different, and therefore I should be ashamed of my religiosity? No. You have a superior belief system. It's not explicit, it's implicit. Actually, your belief system is rationally founded. It's people in this society that don't think about it. No one talks about it anymore. The second aspect was, moving on from that, was that your belief system, in contrast to secular ideology, is an Islamic ideology. So it's not a religion. It's a worldview. Now, the same when you apply that to whether it was laws or religious ideas or things like abortion. We have these debates all the time, and people do and people will forever debate moral and ethical questions. And the view of Hizb ut-Tahrir was, look, these, rationally speaking, are not questions that the mind can judge. It was essentially David Hume's kind of the guillotine of what should the positive and the normative value system, that actually, positively speaking, yes, the mind can judge things, we can observe things and pass judgments, but we can't give values. We can't say how things should be, we can say how things are. What should be must therefore come from God. So levels of taxation in an economy, public or private nationalised industry, should be defined by God. It shouldn't be left for capitalists to then monopolise effectively public sector industries where 6 energy companies now dominate. This is effectively an oligopoly or monopoly in the name of free trade. Rather, those things are public properties because God has decided they belong to the entire world and no one can monopolise them. So this kind of world view that actually gives you an approach to answer every question in your life. So one solution fits all. And that worldview addressed all the political issues. So it addressed things like, okay, yes, Israel exists, it has occupied Palestinian territory for a long period of time. However, the reason for that is because all the Arab leaders are disunited. There are 52 Muslim different countries. If they were united under one army, do you think the Israeli state would still exist today? If all the oil resources of the Arab countries, of OPEC, which a majority are Muslim majority countries, if they were unified, wouldn't that provide a powerful economic base? Isn't that why the West wants to maintain its hegemony, by maintaining the disunity in these countries? And the third thing, it added a religious narrative. So this is the scripture. And I guess the best description is probably, it is pseudo-fundamentalist. So what it does is it cites scripture to bring together the ideology or the belief system. So it's got this. So now what they will do is they will cite verses from the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, statements of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, in order to say, well, Islam is actually not just a religion, it's a political ideology. It's a homogeneous, singular, monolithic entity which then should be enforced over society to solve your economic, social, political and military problems you face. That is what fundamentally differentiates you from the rest of the world, because now you're not a socialist, you're not a capitalist, you're a Muslim. What I would say is you're not really you're an Islamist. You're not someone that you actually now belong to the global, in the same way that you belong to the global proletariat, that the old school socialists would say you're a worker. You're a Muslim that belongs to the global Muslim Ummah, the Muslim fraternity. You're not there to establish the socialist and communist state, but there to establish the Islamic or Sikh/Islamist state, where you'll solve all the world's problems through their interpretation of religion. So it had all those three factors that meant that now I was different completely. My sense of attachment, belonging, my cause, my goal, my objective in life was all well defined and laid out for me. There was a single reference point that I could go back to for any issue that I faced in life. When it came to things like, election time, and me telling my mum, you really shouldn't be taking that polling card and voting. She was like, why? Because it's religiously illicit, it's haram. You're not allowed to vote in a democratic secular society where their laws are man-made. You can only enforce the laws of God. And they're just responsible. No, you're part of this society now. It's a responsibility. You vote. You take part. It's you belong to this country, and this is what you do. And it was a very different mindset, because religion was perfectly fine for them. But when you have this kind of ideologized interpretation, where now you're starting to make what was very extreme anti-establishment political religious edicts, which they'd never heard of at all, they found this problematic. And this is where tensions start, because actually their conception of religion is traditional. It's understanding the religious right, it's understanding the notion of belonging to the Muslims as a fraternity of faith, but belonging to society and doing what is good for the community and society as a whole, as opposed to changing the society to fit your specific ideological worldview. And these were the kinds of conflicts. Many of the people who I grew up with, the people who were actually influential with me at a young age, were horrifically anti the Islamist parties, and they found it very, very problematic. But to be honest, they weren't able to provide an alternative. In my case, I think it wasn't so much a turning point. It was more that when I came across the members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, what they managed to do was instigate an interest and a debate, and also managed to create a sense of grievance and exacerbate the sense of grievance in terms of gain a particular type of political awareness. So we started to look at the world now, and look at the world from the point of view of capitalist hegemony against, the Muslim world. So we started to see it as the Muslim world versus the West. I grew up with the demise of the communist state, so we started to see that capitalism had defeated communism, and Islam was now the only enemy left. And this was how we viewed politics then. Everything was viewed through this kind of block, or these blocks in the world. What we did in Hizb ut-Tahrir is we didn't learn a lot of things, but we learned a few ideas, but we learned them very thoroughly, and we debated them very thoroughly, and we ended up being fairly convincing about how we presented those ideas. And so we understood those things fairly well as our belief system, and we carried that to other people. And so even if we can win over people, we would win the debate. And so even if we didn't win over the individuals, we kind of win the argument. We wouldn't necessarily win the popular crowd, but we would at least try.